I feel a little bit naked following people with such brilliant presentations, but I decided rather than having you look at the screen, I'd have you look at my bald head talking to you about greenhouse gases. Look, New Zealand is quite unique, and it's been really interesting listening this morning. Quite unique among OECD countries, committed absolutely to meeting our obligations in climate change, and see ourselves as being holding a leadership role from some of the smaller nations around the world. And when I say we're unique, if you picture this, approximately just over 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions come from agriculture. We are a country of 5 million people with 25 million sheep and 10 million cattle. Approximately 75% of our agricultural greenhouse gas emissions are enteric methane. Our animals are outside 365 days of the year, 24/7, apart from the short period when they're brought into being milked. A lot of the low-hanging fruit that we're talking about in terms of improving efficiencies have already been done by our farmers. Since the 1980s, there have been no direct subsidies to farmers to pay them to produce or to subsidize their productions. They have dealt with the world market since that time. And so I visited a country which shall remain nameless to protect the innocent a couple of years ago and asked them what were their farmers doing about greenhouse gases, and they talked to me about putting solar panels on the roofs of sheds and putting variable milk speed pumps into the milking sheds. And I thought, our farmers did that 20 years ago, and that's what I mean about that low-hanging fruit. So it puts us in a different position to all of our OECD partners. But when you think about some of the developing nations, as was mentioned by a previous speaker, our emissions profile isn't dissimilar, and so we see ourselves as having an opportunity to lead for the world in terms of enteric methane reductions. So as well as 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions, approximately or just over 80% of our export earnings actually come in through the primary sector as well. So we have an economy that's fueled by farmers, and most of our greenhouse gases coming from that industry as well. So our ability to incentivize farmers to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions doesn't exist, because farmers would be paying themselves to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and they'd put a government bureaucrat in the middle, which I'm sure most of you will understand will not be a very efficient process. As well as that, 95% of the food that we produce is exported, and much of it is exported as a raw food ingredient to actually enter the food chain through very large commercial companies. And those commercial companies, through their shareholders, through their customers, through some of the government schemes, also have to report on their greenhouse gas emissions and the reductions in those greenhouse gas emissions. And so they push that responsibility through to our farmers and growers to ensure that their greenhouse gas emissions are reduced. Now, at a governmental level, we recognized that the science was pointing to a very different role for enteric methane relative to fossil fuel methane, and certainly relative to the long-lived gases. And so we separated those at a policy level when we came up with our Zero Carbon Act a few years back. So our commitment is to be net zero in the long-lived gases, carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, by 2050, to reduce enteric methane by 10% by 2030, and to reduce enteric methane by somewhere between 24 and 47% by 2050, recognizing short-lived gas having not as great a role in the long-term warming of the planet as those long-lived gases. We are currently, that obviously sounds like a huge range, 24 to 47%. Those of you who have read the IPCC documents will recognize that range as it has been put out there before. We've currently got a review happening to determine what will be our commitment in reducing methane. That review is due to be completed by the end of the year. That will inform the government with advice. And the government is committed to reducing methane to the extent that we cause no further warming. Was there anything else I really wanted to say before we ask questions? I suppose, actually, following on from Hazel, I think, you know, we've got very similar challenges to Ireland, an exception being we're obviously a nation that doesn't sit within a federation of nations. Like I said, more than 80% of our net export earnings comes in through the primary sector. So although Ireland obviously has to reduce, has approximately, I think it's 30% or a third of your greenhouse gases from agriculture, Hazel, the export earnings is a very different makeup as well. So again, puts us in that unique position. So we're focusing on solutions very similar to what Hazel outlined as well, and I'm sure will come up in questions. One being genetics. Animal genetics, Ag Research, one of our crown research institutes, has bred a sheep flock over the last decade that has a 10% lower methane footprint per animal than an equivalent non-selected group. In fact, they've managed to do both. They've managed to select for high methane as well, so they've separated those flocks by nearly 20% in the space of just over a decade. So it shows the power of genetics as a permanent, additive, and almost free trait to be selected for. There's been no reduction in productivity in that sheep flock through the selection for methane. Rumen modifiers. Again, a lot of work going on in this space. The idea of probiotics, early life interventions to try and colonize rumen with less or hydrogen utilizers or less methane producing microorganisms. Then methane and nitrous oxide inhibitors as well. So methane inhibitors delivered directly to the animal. Nitrous oxide inhibitors delivered either through fertilizer applications or alternative applications. And of course, the holy grail of them all, a vaccine that we've been working on for quite some time, have had some really positive results in vitro, have not managed to find those results in vivo as yet, but again, considering what Secretary Roche spoke about this morning in terms of the resources that are available to you in this room and around the world in the development of these technologies, I hold out great hope that a vaccine is actually something that we will deliver into the future. One of our key initiatives in recent years is a joint venture between government and industry, 50-50 joint venture. And Wayne McNee will speak more on that later today, so I won't steal his thunder now, but a really exciting venture. And again, for the first time in my research career, money is not the hurdle here. There is no shortage of money to deliver solutions to this methane problem. Capacity, capability, infrastructure, and a collective mindset, I think, are the critical things. And so again, in New Zealand, we recognize that we're a small country, a narrow strip of land in the South Pacific, really affected by climate change, as any of you who've read newspapers about the cyclones and atmospheric rivers that we have been subjected to over the last 12 months, but really positive about international collaborations. And so really, really keen to work with anyone in the world that is willing to work with us to find solutions to this problem. And I'll just finish on that by saying we do have a strong international collaboration with the Irish, not just because of my accent, but because of very, very, very similar production systems and very similar challenges to dealing with this problem. So look, really look forward to the discussion. Thank you, Hermes.